I've been a taxi driver for over 10 years. I've seen a lot: drunk passengers, people trying to skip fares, couples breaking up in the back seat, even a guy who pulled a knife on me once. But nothing prepared me for what happened on a cold October night last year. It was around 2 a.m. when I got a request from an unfamiliar part of town. The streets there were mostly empty, the kind of place where the streetlights barely work and the air feels heavy. The name on the app just said Daniel. No last name, no profile picture, just a location and a pin dropped near an old cemetery at the edge of town. I hesitated. Who the hell orders a taxi from a cemetery in the middle of the night? But a fare's a fare, and I needed the money. I drove there, keeping an eye on the dimly lit road. As I approached the pin, I saw a figure standing near the entrance of the graveyard, barely visible in the darkness. The headlights caught him. A tall man in an old-fashioned black suit, his face pale and expressionless. He didn't move until I pulled up. He opened the door and slid into the back seat. The interior light barely illuminated his features, but something felt off. His eyes were sunken, his skin almost grayish under the glow of the dashboard. "Where to?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He gave me an address on the opposite side of town, about a 30-minute drive. I nodded and started the meter. The drive was silent at first, except for the faint hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio. I tried making small talk, but he didn't respond, just sat there, staring out the window, breathing so softly I could barely hear it. About 10 minutes into the ride, the temperature in the car dropped. I thought maybe the AC was acting up, but when I glanced at the rearview mirror, I nearly slammed on the brakes. He wasn't there. My heart pounded. I turned around in my seat, but the back was empty. The seatbelt was still fastened. I swore under my breath and tried to rationalize it. Maybe he'd slipped out when I wasn't paying attention, but no, that wasn't possible. The car hadn't stopped. The doors had never opened. Then a voice, low, chilling, whispering right next to my ear, "You missed a turn." I jumped so hard, I nearly lost control of the car. My hands were shaking as I looked into the mirror again. He was back, sitting exactly where he had been, as if he had never disappeared. My mouth went dry. My fingers gripped the wheel so tightly they ached. "Sorry," I muttered, forcing myself to keep driving. My pulse hammered in my ears, but I didn't dare look back again. The rest of the drive was agonizingly slow. When we finally reached the destination, a desolate street with a row of abandoned buildings, he simply said, "Here." I stopped the car. My fingers fumbled as I tried to end the ride on the app. When I turned to tell him the fare, the back seat was empty again. The door had never opened. The seatbelt was still buckled. My hands trembled as I checked the rearview mirror one last time. And that's when I saw it. His reflection, still sitting there, grinning at me through the glass. I floored the gas pedal and didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his reflection staring at me. My hands still felt the phantom cold of the back seat. My brain kept replaying the moment he vanished, twice. I even checked the ride history in the app, but there was nothing. No record of a Daniel that night. For days, I tried to convince myself that I had imagined it. Maybe exhaustion had gotten to me. Maybe I had fallen asleep at the wheel and dreamed the whole thing. But then something even stranger happened. A week later, I picked up a woman from the airport. She was in her early 30s, dressed in a navy blue coat, pulling a small suitcase behind her. As soon as she got in, she gave me an address, the same one I had driven to that night. My stomach twisted. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice betraying my nerves. "Yes, that's my father's old house," she said with a tired smile. "I haven't been back in years." I swallowed hard and started driving. The tension in my chest tightened with every mile. When we finally reached the street, I hesitated before stopping in front of the decayed house. She looked out the window, her smile fading. "This place," she whispered. "It looks wrong." I didn't say a word. She opened the door and stepped out cautiously. But just as she reached for her suitcase, she froze. Her face turned pale as if she had seen a ghost. She took a step back, then another. Her breathing quickened. I followed her gaze, my blood running cold. There, standing in the doorway of the abandoned house, was the same man from my taxi that night. Same black suit, same lifeless eyes. Only now, he was looking directly at her. She let out a strangled gasp and stumbled back against the car. "No, no, it's not possible," she whispered, shaking her head. I felt the overwhelming urge to leave, to get away from that place, from him, but I couldn't move. Then, in a voice that made my entire body seize up, she spoke. "That's my father." A gust of wind slammed the car door shut. She turned to me, her face pale and full of something I couldn't quite place. Fear, confusion, or realization. "My father died 10 years ago." The man in the doorway didn't move. He just stood there, watching. A shiver ran down my spine as I finally forced my foot onto the gas pedal. I didn't wait for her to get back inside. I just drove, barely hearing her desperate footsteps behind me as she ran. The ride history never saved. The address disappeared from my records. And for weeks after that, every time I checked my rear-view mirror, I half expected to see him there, grinning at me through the glass. For days after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. It wasn't just a memory of the man in the suit or the way his daughter had reacted. It was the way the air felt heavy, like I had carried something with me from that place. My apartment felt colder. Shadows stretched longer than they should. And no matter how many times I checked, my rear-view mirror always seemed off. Then the nightmare started. At first, they were just flashes. An empty road, headlights flickering. A figure sitting in my back seat, his pale face half hidden in the darkness. But the more they happened, the more vivid they became. In one, I was driving, unable to stop, my hands locked on the wheel. The man in the back seat slowly leaned forward, whispering something I couldn't understand. His breath was ice against my ear. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, only to find my bedroom clock blinking at exactly 2:47 a.m., the same time I had picked him up that night. The dreams got worse. In another, I was parked outside a house I didn't recognize, the engine running. I turned to look in the back seat, but instead of the man, I saw myself, my own reflection, sitting there, staring at me. And behind it, he was there, grinning. I started dreading my night shifts. The silence of the car felt unbearable. Every ride turning into an exercise in paranoia. I found myself constantly checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something that shouldn't be there. And then one night, I did. It was a slow shift, barely any rides coming through. I was parked in a dimly lit lot near an old gas station, scrolling through my phone when my radio crackled with static. At first, I thought it was interference, but then I heard it soft, distorted breathing. I reached for the radio to turn it off, but before I could, a voice whispered through the speaker, "You missed a turn." My stomach dropped. Slowly, my eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. He was there, sitting in the back seat, just as he had been that night. Same suit, same hollow stare. Only this time, he was smiling. My breath hitched. My body refused to move. It felt like I was frozen in place, trapped in some nightmare I couldn't wake up from. His reflection was clear, solid, real. But when I turned around, the back seat was empty. I slammed the door open and stumbled out of the car, gasping for air. My hands shook as I circled around, yanking the back door open. Nothing, no sign of him, no trace that anyone had ever been there. But as I stood there, the night pressing in around me, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The back seat was ice cold, and in the condensation on the window, as if traced by an unseen hand, was a single word. Soon, I didn't go back to work for a few days after that. I told myself I needed a break, that maybe I was just overworked, exhausted. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had seen something that didn't make sense, something that shouldn't be possible. And now, it wasn't just following me in my dreams. It was real. The word soon haunted me. I tried wiping it away, but every time I looked at the window, I swore I could still see faint traces of it, like it had been burned into the glass. I avoided my car as much as I could, but on the fifth night, my phone buzzed with a notification from the taxi app. A ride request. There was no name, no profile picture, just a pin dropped on the exact same spot near the cemetery. My chest tightened. My finger hovered over the screen. Decline it. Just decline it. But before I could, my phone screen flickered and glitched. The app froze. And then, in bold black letters across the top of the screen, a single word appeared. Now, the phone went dark. I nearly threw it across the room. My heart pounded so hard it felt like my ribs would crack. I didn't accept the ride. I didn't even open the app again. I turned off my phone, locked every door, and stayed inside, trying to convince myself that it was just some bizarre glitch, a coincidence. And then 3 knocks. Slow, heavy, right outside my front door. I stopped breathing. My apartment was on the 3rd floor. No one ever knocked this late. I stood frozen, staring at the door. My mind screamed at me not to move, not to answer. But then my phone, still turned off, buzzed violently on the table. I hesitated before reaching for it. The screen shouldn't have been on. The battery had been dead. But there it was, glowing in the darkness. A single notification. Your ride has arrived. The knocking came again. I backed away from the door, my breath shaking. My hands trembled as I reached for the light switch. But before I could turn it on, the door handle twisted. I bolted. I ran to my bedroom, locked the door, and pressed my back against it, heart hammering in my chest. The apartment was silent now. No knocks, no sounds. But then, just as I thought it was over, a whisper, low, faint, right on the other side of the door. You missed a turn. I didn't sleep that night. By the time the sun rose, I packed a bag, left my apartment, and never went back. I changed cities, got a new job, ditched the taxi business altogether. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I still feel it. That heavy presence lingering just beyond the corner of my eye. And when I pass by a parked car or glance at a window's reflection, I swear, for just a second, I see him, still sitting in the back seat, still waiting, still smiling. For weeks after I left the city, I tried to convince myself that I was safe, that whatever had happened, whatever I had seen, was tied to that place, that car, that job. But deep down, I knew better. It wasn't over. The sign started small, a flickering streetlight whenever I walked past, the hum of static on my phone when I made a call, the cold spots in my new apartment, always near the door, always at night. Then the nightmares returned, worse than before. I was back in my taxi, driving through endless, fog-covered streets. The city around me was empty. No lights, no people, just a void of black asphalt stretching infinitely ahead. I knew I shouldn't look in the mirror. I knew what I would see. But something, some force compelled me. And there he was, not sitting this time, leaning forward, his mouth close to my ear, his breath ice cold. You can't run forever. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. I grabbed it with shaking hands. The screen was on. The taxi app was open. A new ride request. No name. No pickup location. Just a single message. Look outside. My stomach clenched. My hands shook as I slowly turned my head toward the window. The curtains were closed, but I could feel it. Someone watching me from the other side of the glass. I swallowed hard. No, I wasn't going to look. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing myself to take slow, steady breaths. I was done playing this game. I wasn't going to fall into its trap again. The buzzing stopped. Silence filled the room. For a moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, it was over. Then the temperature dropped. A breath, cold and shallow. Not mine. Right behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. The door was locked. I was alone. But my phone wasn't in my hand anymore. It was on my bed, screen up, and across the glass, written in the condensation of my own breath, was a single word. Soon. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I didn't even turn off the lights. I just sat there, staring at my phone, at that single word burned into the screen. Soon, morning came, but the feeling of being watched never left. Every shadow seemed darker, every silence too heavy. I forced myself to go outside, to pretend things were normal, but the world no longer felt real. The moment I stepped out of my apartment, I saw it. A taxi, parked across the street, engine running. It wasn't mine. I had sold my car before leaving town. This was different, older, black, the kind you don't see anymore. The windows were tinted, but I knew. I knew someone was inside. I turned away, heart hammering, trying to ignore the way the air felt thick and suffocating. But as I walked past, my phone buzzed in my pocket. A message. Ride started. I stopped dead in my tracks. No, I hadn't requested a ride. I hadn't even opened the app. Slowly, my eyes drifted back to the car. The back seat window was rolled down just an inch, just enough for me to see a sliver of a pale face, a hint of black fabric, and then a whisper carried by the wind. Get in. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. My breath came in short, ragged bursts. The world around me blurred. Then beep. A normal taxi, a real one, pulled up right in front of me. The driver leaned out. You call for a ride? I turned back toward the black car. It was gone, like it had never been there. I didn't answer the driver. I just turned around and walked back inside, locking every door behind me. But deep down, I knew it didn't matter. You can lock doors. You can change cities. You can run. But some rides never end. Some passengers never leave. And somewhere, in the reflection of a rear-view mirror, he's still waiting, still watching, still smiling,